Well, here we are at the conclusion of the book of Jeremiah. I always find when I study closely a book of the Bible that the author becomes almost like a good friend, someone familiar to me. So it's kind of mixed feelings that I leave Jeremiah behind. My opinion, this book is one of the most personal, I guess, books in the Bible in the sense that we get a real look at Jeremiah the man, how much he suffered for the Lord, how he was obedient even though his life was threatened so many times. And we get a kind of a glimpse of the man himself. And we'll see this when we come to the book of Ezekiel as well. But we're going to be bidding Jeremiah goodbye today as we look at Jeremiah chapter 52, which I call the Jerusalem conquered. I should have called it the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem conquered. Just kind of recapping and closing out the book. Remember, Jeremiah is topically organized, and after talking about the destruction of Babylon, he is now going to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Lots of things that are mentioned in this chapter, so it's a busy chapter. I have a number of headings throughout the chapter. Begins in verses 1 through 5 with the siege of Jerusalem. Now, a siege is a military maneuver where a city is surrounded and supplies in and out of the city are cut off and restricted. The idea basically is to starve everyone out of the city or make it so weakened that it would easily fall to an assault by the opposing force. Verse 1, the whole section really provides us with a chronology of the events associated with the fall of Jerusalem. When we sort all these things out, what we find is the siege began on January 15th in 588 and ended on July 18th, 586. As I'm recording this, it's July 19th, so it's been about 2,608 years since this event occurred, since the end of the siege of Jerusalem. Then the destruction of Jerusalem began on August 14th, 586. Again, about 2,608 years ago. So that's the siege in verses 1 through 5. Next thing we see is desertion, surprisingly, in verses 6 through 11. And what happens here in verses 6 and 7, we see the siege has its effect, and people are starving to the point where they try to flee. So the king and his military contingent attempt to flee toward the desert, but Zedekiah was captured, and he and his men are taken to Nebuchadnezzar's battlefield command post in Riblah, which is north of Jerusalem. And in verses 10 to 11, it's a sad situation, but the last thing that Zedekiah sees is the slaughter of his own children. So he had been warned and warned again by the prophets to not resist, but he did resist, and as a result suffered personally and suffered emotionally, seeing his own children killed. Verses 12 through 14 then continue with the destruction of Jerusalem. We see the temple in verse 13, what's called the house of the Lord. The king's house and every large house in Jerusalem were burnt down. So total devastation here. Then the walls are destroyed. The effect of this is to leave the city not only desolate inside, but indefensible at this point, with no walls around it. Nehemiah later will rebuild these walls from the rubble that was left, but at this point they're being torn down and removed. Deportation is in verses 15 and 16, so we have a siege, destruction, deportation. This is the last of really 3 exiles. There was one in 605, another in 597, and this is the last one. And there's actually a series, we'll talk about this in a moment here, but in 586. So we read about these artisans, or these unskilled farm workers, basically, who are left in the land to tend the land, to take care of the olives and vineyards and things like that, in order to provide Nebuchadnezzar with tribute. They're left in the land, but it seems like anyone with skills are taken away. So they're taken into captivity. We read about some of these people that were left in the land. We read about them in Jeremiah 40 and 43. Some of these are the people who fled to Egypt, and there the Lord hunted them down and destroyed them in Egypt. See the city really dismantled in verses 17 through 23. So we see articles of worship that were inside and outside of the temple taken apart, dismantled, and taken away. So we see them again later in Daniel chapter 5, verse 3, where Belshazzar, on the night that Babylon is destroyed by Darius the Mede, he brings these out and brings them to basically a wine drinking party, and they are used there in a very irreverent way, and that begins the downfall of Babylon. Presumably, I think at this point the Ark of the Covenant is taken, but it's not mentioned here. In fact, the last time the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned is in 2 Chronicles 35, in the first part of the chapter, where it's talking about the reinstatement of the Passover under Josiah's reign. It's the last time we see the Ark. The fact that it's not mentioned here has led to some speculation that perhaps the Ark was taken to a hidden chamber beneath the Temple Mount and stored there. Others that it was possibly taken into the desert and stored. Others even that it was taken to as far away as Ethiopia, and it exists there today in a temple, a synagogue. But we don't know what happened to the ark ultimately. It is mentioned in 2 Chronicles, and there's an ark in heaven in the book of Revelation. But as for the ark on the earth, we really don't know where it is. And I think I'll do a video in the future on the history of the ark, as far as we know from the Bible, and some more details about the speculation about where the ark might be. We see really death in chapters 24 through 27. So Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, the local representative of Nebuchadnezzar in Jerusalem, gathers up the spiritual and civil leaders, takes them to Nebuchadnezzar at his battlefield headquarters in Riblah, and there they're executed. Now, why does he do that? I think Nebuchadnezzar is removing any potential leaders that would be able to organize the people into revolt against his rule, or even possibly a counterattack. We'll see, which we saw in chapters 40 to 43, a assassination of Gedaliah, his governor there, and potential revolt that needed to be put down. So these leaders are taken away. We see deportation again in more detail in verses 28 through 30. It's a series of deportations spread over 23 years, beginning in 586, and summarizes that 4,600 people were taken into captivity. Seems like a relatively small number, and may only count, as is typical in the Bible, adult men. So this might be just a partial count. You can multiply that by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times, considering the size of families at the time, and quite a substantial number of people taken into captivity. You might want to go back at some point. Jeremiah 29 talks about the Lord's instructions for those who are in captivity, which was essentially settle down and be good citizens. Finally, the chapter ends on a high note, a note of hope, a note of optimism. Evil Murdoch, the name of a ruler that succeeded Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned for just a short time, succeeded him in 562. He, at this point, Jehoiachin had been in prison for about 27 years, and evil Murdoch brings him out of prison, treats him well, takes care of him, invites him to be at the table of the king. Different policy is being followed here by this king with regard to conquered nations. Again, Jehoiachin released from prison and living the end of his life in relative comfort. I think the book ends on this high note as a note of hope. God has not forgotten the Davidic dynasty. He has not abandoned them. He is still with them. He is working. So there's still hope for Israel even after the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah. We've seen this in the previous chapters that talk about the destruction of Babylon. God hasn't forgotten his people, even down to today. Some would say that God has forgotten Israel, that the church has replaced him, and nothing could be further from the truth. They don't know what they're talking about. They're definitely ignoring the Bible and spiritualizing a lot of texts that talk about God's plans for Israel in the future. So, brothers and sisters, we can stand firm in our expectation that God will, in fact, restore Israel to the land. Many believe that that is taking place since 1948. Seems to me, if you look at immigration statistics and the situation around the world, that Aliyah, going up to Jerusalem from these Gentile nations, is in fact happening today, and we know that this will lead ultimately to the events described in the book of Revelation, culminating in what Daniel looked forward to, the coming of the Messianic kingdom. So look up. I think our salvation is near. The Lord's return is near. Take hope as Israel took hope reading the last few verses of the book of Jeremiah. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Next time we're going to be in the book of Lamentations. It's not a major book. I'm including it in our study to close out Jeremiah and see the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem before we go into Ezekiel and Daniel as we continue our study through the year of these major prophets. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll say farewell to this section, farewell to the book of Jeremiah. God bless you.